we invent, and if we're lucky and persistent and strategic, we innovate and create new value. That was one of the themes of the conversation that just took place before the three of you joined me on stage. But in an ever-connected world, a world driven by, supported by, and enabled by the Internet of everything, how do we actually protect those inventions? How do we protect the innovations? How do we ensure that we are creating value and that we capture that value in the United States? That's one of the topics I'd like to really discuss with the three of you. As you know, we all live, work, and play in a hyper-connected world, but one that has perhaps some fraying at the edges. As we've just learned from the White House Council of Economic Advisors, malicious cyber activity in the United States ran at about anywhere from 57 billion to a little over 120 billion in 2016. If we look globally, by 2019, that is expected to run at about $2.1 trillion, not billion, trillion, of cyber attacks and cyber nefarious activities. So that problem is significant, it's costly, and in fact in the United States is some ways more costly than in other parts of the world. I think the average, and I think this comes from some of the Verizon data, George, that you and your team have shared, the average cost of a cyber breach in the US is around $8 million. It's only $5 million in Germany or Canada. And that's also the same on a per capita level. So, it's not, this is significant dollars. This is real money. And the threat is asymmetric. It's not just South Korea, North Korea, China, whoever might be engaging. This is really about individuals who are attacking institutions and organizations at a level we've never really seen before. Now, we know that the government is taking some steps to address this, but I think one of the powerful opportunities we have with this conversation is that the three of you are really at the vanguard of the private sector as well as our national laboratory infrastructure in dealing with this issue. And in fact, Steve, George, you along with Farnham Jahanian recently chaired, as Deborah Wint-Smith mentioned this morning, a major report called Secure that is really trying to map out a cybersecurity roadmap for the country. So Steve, I'm really going to open it up to you first to perhaps describe a little bit about what is Secure. Why did you all get involved with this? And then I'd like to really transition to Nilu and George to dive deeper into some of the opportunities we might have to really enact some of the key recommendations we have in that report.
Sure, Chad. Thanks a lot for the introduction and the opportunity to talk a little bit about this report. This is something that's very important to all of us. How many of you have had personal data compromised? All right. By more than one source, right? How many have kids who compromise your data without you knowing about it? All right. That's happened to all of us. But you might ask why the DOE or why is the lab director interested in this? Well, obviously, I've got concerns about keeping Pacific Northwest National Laboratory safe, but it also turns out that the DOE and the DOE labs have been involved in cybersecurity for more than 20 years. We have a responsibility to protect certain information that we have at the laboratories. The department has responsibility for the energy sector writ large. And in addition to that, we also have tremendous capabilities that we've made available to other agencies and entities to help them, whether it's utilities for the grid or some of our intelligence communities to understand what the threats are from abroad. So there's tremendous capabilities out there. So when the council said they wanted to look at this challenge of cybersecurity, what it means, I was very interested in getting involved in that and working on it. And we just put this report out just a few weeks ago, and I commend it to you. It's called Secure. It's a council report. And it was a year-long activity over 2018 in which George Farnham and I, working with the council's team and many others, had a series of 3 dialogues that looked at issues from the perspective of private industry, from national security, and our capstone event was really looking at what are some of the things the government can do about this. And we put out here a number of recommendations. Really, they're in 3 or 4 areas. And there's about 150 people from academia, government, industry that came together to look at this problem and provide their insights. I can't go through all of it in the short time we've got, but in 4 areas, it's about what we can do to better secure our critical assets, not just the grid, but beyond that and our infrastructure. What we can do to strengthen our ability to more quickly respond to and recover from an attack, because we recognize they're increasingly happening. What we can do to make sure we have the highly trained workforce of the future that we need. We're all desperately looking for that talent to help us safeguard our assets. And finally, how we can improve engagement with various stakeholders, especially the government. And one of the things here I want to emphasize is some of the work we're looking at and how we can better coordinate. We're just talking a little bit about here. A lot of people talk about cybersecurity. including in the government, and there's many initiatives coming out of it, but they tend to be uncoordinated. And we think a lot better results would be obtained if we coordinated what we're doing, looking across this, thinking about even what do we do to develop a national R&D strategy around this, both in the near term what we need to do to protect ourselves, but also in the longer term where we can get academia involved and look at some of the ground challenges, how we really fundamentally change the paradigm to go from the attacker to the defender having the natural advantage. And so one of the things we call for is really the launch of a cybersecurity R&D initiative that would bring together the various parts of the government and various communities to look at this. We've also talked about how we can improve cybersecurity throughout the value chain, and really talking about a little bit the pros and cons and how would you actually do it of having security by design within products rather than an add-on after the fact. It's a lot easier said than done. How do you incentivize that? And also looking at areas where we could perhaps just enforce existing laws. There's things we've already put out there related to the Internet of Things, certain laws where we simply enforce it and recognize that we are in a global competition and that we're not necessarily playing all by the same rules. And finally, we're looking at what we can even do within the states of tapping resources. Is one of the great ideas come up in one of our conversations was around whenever we're in a time of crisis, we often turn to our National Guards to help us. Well, it turns out several of the National Guards, including the Washington State National Guard, has responsibility around cyber intervention. What do we do in case of a cyber attack? Can we leverage that kind of capability beyond the normal storm response to a cyber response team? And also, when you look at the workforce we need, in addition to the students, as we've heard, we have a number of veterans coming back who want to give back to this country, who want to get STEM educated. Why not turn them into some of the cyber professionals we need? They understand the risks, they understand the threat environment, they're willing to give back. So those are a few of the things I would say to look at in this report, and I would just encourage you to take a look at it. There are 4 areas which talk about, I mentioned those, and a host of recommendations. And already we've had a chance to mention these, some of our congressional stakeholders who've asked for more information on these recommendations. So Chad, thanks for the chance to talk a little bit about the report, maybe set the stage.
Yeah, no, Steve, thank you. I'm going to come back, but first I want to transition to Nilu. Nilu, thank you for being with us. For those of you who don't, Nilu is until very recently the Chief Strategy Officer of RSA, deep experience in this space. So Nilu, Steve teed up a whole range of challenges, small to large. And riffing on a theme from earlier in the day, no one company, no one lab, no one university can possibly accomplish meeting the task that Steve laid out. Given your experiences, could you maybe share why you think public-private partnerships could be a model to, in some sense, engage on the issues that Steve raised, and maybe even point to some successful models or elements of success that we might begin to think about, tease out, and really scale nationally?
I'd love to do that. So context is kind of important here. What we have is absolutely a shared problem between public sector, private sector, academia, individuals, et cetera. And when you think about how the internet started, right, it wasn't designed with security in mind. In fact, it was designed to be open and interoperable. And the reason for that was it was a small group of trusted organizations that communicated with each other and wanted to be able to share information openly with each other. We never anticipated that every aspect of our lives was going to be tethered to this medium. Our personal lives, our economic lives, our businesses, our military, our government. Over time, our dependence on this medium has grown in a way that was absolutely not anticipated. And what's driven that is a pace of innovation, which we absolutely don't want to slow down, because that innovation has also driven a lot of growth, a lot of profitability, business outcomes, et cetera. So on the positive side, because it was open and because it was interoperable, we've been able to use it to drive innovation, to drive growth, to create sort of a lot of economic wealth. The downside of that is that the malfeasance that can take place in this medium has also grown as we've become completely dependent on it, right? So, and that malfeasance also impacts every single player in this environment, whether it's the government from a national security perspective, from an economic security perspective, whether it's businesses and profitability and uptime, et cetera, and whether it's individuals with respect to our data or with respect to our ability to access resources. So everything from IP theft to hate speech, et cetera, can now happen in this medium. Now, you layer on top of that the fact that security was an afterthought, and the industry itself grew up in a very siloed way. So when you look at the cybersecurity industry, 20 years ago, we were all working in sort of the basement offices, and we were sort of off in the corner. We weren't even as good as the IT folks. And it was not viewed as being, not that we weren't as competent, but you know, there's a reason why you sort of have this like introverted, hidden, hoodied, misanthropic vision of what a cybersecurity professional looks like. But today, that's not what it is. Today, it's not an IT problem. It's not a technology problem. Cybersecurity is actually, it's a business problem.
Strategic.
Right? It's a strategic problem. And we haven't evolved from that original model of, you know, open internet, completely tied to it, good and bad things can happen. And the industry over here, by the way, has spun off somewhere close to 12,000 companies that are each solving one problem really well, right? And most of these companies are real, and what they say they do, they actually really do. But it turns out when you bolt on 500 of those solutions, you actually can't stop the attacker from coming in. So it's a shared problem that we all have to come together to resolve. Now, for it to work, we all have to do our bit, right? So the private sector has to do its bit. There's things that only the private sector can do, right? Protecting our networks, protecting the data in the networks, securing those networks, that is absolutely the responsibility of every organization. There are things that only the government can do. And typically, I sort of play the skunk in the picnic role of pointing out that I don't believe the government is actually doing its bit to help us. And when it talks about imposing more regulation and more liability in a world where it is not using its tools of power to stop bad things from happening, it is not helpful to private sector, because you can impose all the liability you want, but we cannot stop nation-state actors from coming after us. So until there's a deterrence policy, until there's an escalation policy, until there's real teeth to what the government does, I don't think it's actually useful to talk about imposing more liability or more regulation. And then, of course, there's things that we have to do jointly, setting standards, et cetera. So, and by the way, the government piece gets even bigger than that. That to me is the most obvious example. But coming up, you talked about, Steve, a research strategy, a national research strategy. We need to have a national cybersecurity strategy. We need to have a national cybersecurity strategy by industry. We need one for manufacturing, for example. And it's really the government's responsibility to lead that effort together with the private sector. And until we pull that together and have a national strategy and then organize ourselves to succeed, right? So right now, you have one agency that has authority to deal with critical infrastructure and with the private sector, but it doesn't have the capabilities. You have a different agency that has all the capabilities, but it is actually by authority prevented from interacting with the private sector. So we are not organized to succeed in the US government in this sector. So everyone has to step up to the table. Now, the best way this happens, and it is happening, is through cooperation, not through a hammer and stick method. So one great example is the Enduring Security Framework, where classified information is shared with a group of top executives. And the idea is not just information sharing, but it's also problem solving. So in 2010, a particularly widespread vulnerability existed in computer systems, and a nation-state actor was going to use that to basically brick a very large group of computers. Through the ESF framework, a group of folks were brought together. The information that the NSA had uncovered, the classified source, was shared with this group. And a different group was convened of manufacturers and vendors who then engineered this problem away. So within 18 months, the ability of a nation state to actually use this vulnerability disappeared. It was baked into the NIST framework, and it was put into all federal contract requirements. So that is a great example of a cooperative approach to doing that. A much more recent example, just a couple of weeks ago, Cyber Command, and I think this is fantastic, started uploading malware samples from nation states into VirusTotal so that the security research industry could start studying nation state tools. How awesome is that? Because it is not widely available to them. So this is a great example of Cyber Command just stepping up and saying, we're going to start sharing this information because shining a light on the tools the nation states are using to come after our companies is one of the best things we can do. And it would have been unheard of for them to do this a few years ago. There's a lot more examples that I could sort of go on, but I'll.
No, that's great. No, thanks, Neela. And we'll come back to it because I want to.
We had previously agreed to give her all the tough questions.
Okay, well then,
Do I see your
softball coming.
deck?
Yeah, softball coming to you, George.
Thank you. Thank you.
So, Neelu and Steve both just teased up this idea of security as an afterthought, security not baked in, not part of the DNA. George, I'd like maybe if you could share some stories around Verizon, technological preeminent leader in this space, working very hard to bake in that security while also ensuring productivity, never down, always enabling business. Can you share a little bit about what you're doing and what are the opportunities and challenges you all are facing?
Absolutely. And I'll first very quickly comment on, I agree with everything you said, but I'll be a little bit contrarian.
Awesome.
Awesome.
Go for it.
In the report, what you'll read is nation-state actors, bad actors, very bad actors, well-funded, well-organized, extremely technical. Then we talk a lot about IT hygiene, which is completely within our hands. So I like to divide up that and then add on additional social engineering and other cultural issues that are causing people to not be situationally aware around spear phishing and the other things that happen that cause malware injection, et cetera. So what I don't want to do is say, gee, why don't we all go home tonight and take a nap, and the government's going to solve it for us in the morning. So from my position is we have to stake out very carefully what is our responsibility, how we're going to do it, under the framework of an organized plan, a strategy, an investment, et cetera. So I think that that's critical because we've underspent on our technology, we've rolled out technology, we've not patched our machines, we've done all sorts of things like that that basically are waving the red flag in front of criminals to attack us and steal our IP and our technology. So with that said, though, I think that we're on the cusp of a big confluence of privacy, data proliferation. Right now, cloud is only about, what do you say, 15% adopted, right? So there's all this data and there's all this stuff around here, and now concepts like contextual privacy. By the way, everyone in this room that said that their information was breached, are you upset about it? You're upset about it, but if you ask a millennial, they'll say, you know, it comes with the territory, right? So I think some of those things are changing. But we're now in the beginnings of a new technology. From a Verizon perspective, we're going to be rolling out 5G. You say, well, okay, great. What does that mean? Better phone calls, clear, can you hear me now, all that stuff. It's more that the velocity of data and the velocity of instant and basically real-time insights into customer and operational data is going to happen. But here's what's interesting about it. It's going to be new hardware, new technology, and it's going to run over a wireless network. So from our perspective, that's why we're investing so heavily in it, because we have the authentication and core and protection to provide a higher level of transport. But the reason we have to pay attention to everything the other panelists were talking about is that this data at the edge or in this room is going to be video, it's going to be audio, it's going to be voice and text that's converged, it's going to be supply chain information, most likely financial transactions, in addition to human interaction. And that's the expectation of business today. It used to be backroom batch operations where you're putting ERP systems, then an explosive e-commerce environment where everything is online, and now to run all those systems, the information to immediately have. So we need to take care of this information and guard against all the things we're talking about, unnecessary access, et cetera. If we do not get together and do that, we're going to have a have and have not situation where there's going to be some systems and companies that are doing a very, very good job, and there's others that are going to fall out. So there's going to be a natural market reaction to not having a secure environment, and it will become increasingly brand damaging. So not only is there government constraints and potentially fines, GDPR is a very serious situation, right? Your second or third violation of having some sort of privacy data leak, it's a percentage of your revenue. It could be tens of millions of dollars, right? So there's a whole series of new laws that are coming. The bottom line is we have to invest in technology. We have to have an integrated approach to how we develop new technology that doesn't bolt on. What you said about having 12,000 companies, it's probably more than that. There's new ones coming out every minute. So network technology, multi-factor authentication with identity. So having a global identity that's managed and protected, more specific encryption, and IT hygiene. We're very, very much investing in that. But for us, it's all about having a pervasive global network that's super secure, fully encrypted and protected to deliver information at a personal level.
And if I can agree with George for a second, I know you want to disagree with me. But
I try.
But I think what he said is very important, which is, and this goes back to cybersecurity being a silo, we can't think about cybersecurity as its own pillar anymore. It is part of a larger IT transformation strategy that every organization has to go through. And if we think about cybersecurity here and think about IT transformation here, we will never solve the problem. So we just have to really make it its one thing, and cyber is a core element of any IT upgrade transformation process that any organization has to go through.
Right.
Well, I'd like to dive deeper, and we just have a few minutes left, but I want to come back to a point all three of you have raised, whether it's a national cybersecurity strategy under which there would be a national R&D strategy. Can we go deeper on that? I've heard everything from velocity, diversity of data, shift to wireless, shift to cloud. What does this research agenda look like? What audit look like? Where should we be investing? What's a priority for this country?
Well, just a quick plug for NIST, right? It's fairly straightforward now, right? When it first came out, it was like, oh my goodness, there's a framework. But that's a great start, to have a single umbrella framework so that you can organize your activities, understand what your posture is, understand what your investments are, and map a strategic plan to get to the endpoint, and be able to do that in a very organized, reportable way. That's a very good start. It's kind of good, it's just good project management with that. It gets a lot more sophisticated from there. That's where we turn to you.
Well, I would add on. I think that one of the things we can do, if you look at it, we do call in the report for a national cybersecurity initiative. We would look at various aspects of it. One part of it is on the research. And right now, the research itself is siloed. NSF will have calls over here, DOE's got some activities over here, you go to the various parts of DOD. What I think is really necessary is for us to bring it together, and you do that by bringing together the community. So one of the things that the Department of Energy's Office of Science does very well is something called these basic research needs workshops, in which they bring together hundreds of members from the technical community to talk about where's this field going, to map that out, that is then used to guide what will be eventually departmental requests and congressional investments in certain areas to move a discipline forward. If you think about doing that, where we bring together some of the knowledgeable people, and the thing's a little different here, is this is one of the few areas where when you look at what's going on in the classified side, that R&D is pretty darn advanced compared to what's going on in the unclassified. And so rationalizing that, so you can have the agencies like the NSA and others who understand some of the threat and some of the capabilities much more intimately than most of the people in the unclassified realm do. Bring that together to understand how we can meet some of the near-term needs, what the problems are. But I think there are some grand challenges that the community, getting the labs, academics, industry folks together to say, all right, not today's problem, but what about 10 years or 15 years from now? How do we finally change our paradigm of computing so that rather than attacking a static architecture, you have a dynamically changing one? Remember the old Star Trek thing, modulate the shields, right? You're removing frequency.
Why is it that you know that?
I know it too.
Be quiet, George. So I can't hear you. But I think there's a case where we can bring together the folks to really define what are some of those things. And that would be a goal where we could put out a handful of grand challenges to say, these are the grand cyber computer science challenges we have to work on. Put those out there and have an agreement that we're going to have an investment. There are examples of multi-agency coordinated investments that we're doing, in computing even, in other areas. We're talking about right now, earlier today, about quantum, all right? That's going to involve many agencies. We just need to have the will to say, this is important to us, we need to be a leader here, and this is a place where we can do it. And we can't just say, well, it's one or the other.
And the only thing I add to this is we cannot lose the quantum computing race. We simply cannot lose that race.
Why?
Because the implications from a security perspective, let alone are
compute capability.
Yeah, I mean, you break encryption. when you get to quantum. So your ability to secure, not that it's impossible, but it just gets very, very difficult. So there's no question we're starting to lose our edge from a research perspective in this country. We are not, Napolitano talked about this very eloquently at lunch. We cannot lose our R&D edge, and we are losing our R&D edge. So when it comes to quantum supercomputing, when it comes to encryption, when it comes to artificial intelligence, I mean, these are game changers, and even though they're not real today, the implications for the first group to get to them are pretty massive. So I mean, everything else is great, but if we lose that race.
Well, and you said to me earlier, why are you so excited about 5G? Other than I work for Verizon, which is it's a good thing, but the 5G project that we're doing and the One Fiber project is everything we were talking about earlier about investing into infrastructure. Having pervasive fiber that's secure, that's massively available, that allows you to deliver applications and content faster than anything ever before, like response times going from 200 milliseconds down to 5 milliseconds. All of that stuff for venue management, robotics, everything you're talking about where pervasive network capability will enable new applications and huge amounts of innovation, just like quantum. It's just a different, all of these things are going to happen right now. So the risk factor of all that is potentially not taking care of the basics of security that we talked about that would potentially give us issues of that. So we've got to invest. The promise of the return of these investments is enormous. Every single thing that was talked about over the last day and a half could flourish with these base technologies, whether it's quantum or short of quantum, 5G, all of that leads to that, but it all begins with security. So I kind of urge everybody that has influence or is talking about security, let them see the security report. This is also foundational for us next year, right? We can be able to take this, the work that's been done and then build layers of complexity on it. We probably would add some of the data and privacy, but I think we have a good start to have a more intelligent conversation than we've ever had, but we really need you guys to be engaged, and when we announce some of these meetings, would love to have your participants.
Steve, you had some thoughts?
I just want to follow on. You were asking why we can't afford to lose the quantum race, but I would just generalize it more to certain areas. We have to define as a country, where can't we afford to lose the race in quantum? You know, what other topics are there? As a country, we've got less than 5% of the world's population. We've depended on our superiority in science and technology as a force multiplier, both for our national security as well as for our economic prosperity. And that becomes an asymmetric weapon used against us, where people can undermine that capability by turning it against us. That's going to be a problem. It won't be the inconvenience of changing a password or getting a new credit card. It'll be having millions of devices bricked. It'll having weapons platforms not performing as they're supposed to be. It's going to be other countries overtaking us economically. That's why we have to get this right, and we have to put the will into it to define it. I think we have to define this whole area of computing in general and cybersecurity as an integrated part of it, not as a separate silo, as one of those areas this nation cannot afford to lose the race to anyone in.
Well, on that note,
You're here.
think
All right, who's with us?
Let's go!
Let's go.
The hill's that way.
Yeah. No, I want to thank all three of you very much for this really enlightening conversation and for challenging us for the coming year. I think we set out an agenda that we'll have to follow up on through our commission and other work. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Chad.